Welcome to Momming as a Millennial, the podcast where we explore the intersection of tradition and modern parenting. Have you ever felt overwhelmed trying to balance being a mom with your professional aspirations, all while dealing with side-eye from your parents who think you're doing it wrong? Me too. I'm your host, Christine Gerizzo, a journalist, blogger, and proud mama of 2 young children. I'm so glad you're here with me. Together, we can navigate the complexities of millennial motherhood and find what resonates with our true, authentic selves. Let's dive in. Welcome back to part 2 of Boundary is Not a Dirty Word. I'm joined again by my good friend, Bryanna Rayford. We had so much to discuss about this topic, so we had to break it up into 2 parts because our first conversation definitely went a little long. I think we had a lot of great discussion. So in a previous episode, we talked about boundaries with our parents and our in-laws and specific examples of situations that have arisen where we felt the need to establish boundaries and what that looked like. So in part 2, we're really going to talk about the benefit of establishing boundaries and then how you go about establishing those healthy boundaries and some tips. So in our last episode, you had mentioned, Bryanna, that setting clear boundaries isn't always easy or welcomed. And I think you experienced that with your husband's side of the family. And while it's best to set expectations from the start, especially if your parents are regularly babysitting your children, so when they're infants, that's not always the case because things come up that you're just not prepared for. No matter where you are in your parenting journey or how old your kids are, I think it's always okay to stop and explain your boundary to whoever you need to.
And I think that's a great point because one of the messages that we've received specifically on my husband's side was we didn't think that there would be boundaries for us as grandparents. So while I do think maybe it was coming from a place of, as a grandparent, how they want to be involved, I still think there needs to be discussions around what the parents are comfortable with. And even if it's something as innocent as wanting to pick up the child to take them to the park, if that's something that parents are not okay with, there needs to be discussion. There should never be an assumption that because we're this person in the family or we're related by this way, that boundaries don't apply. Boundaries exist in all aspects of our life. And I think more so when it comes to someone's child, we need to take great care and caution when addressing boundaries and really making sure that the parent is heard.
Yeah, and I think you touched on a couple of things that I want to get a little deeper into. The first one being really just about having a conversation. So setting boundaries might sound scary, but I think in a lot of instances, it's just having a conversation and letting that other party know what you're comfortable with. The other thing you said that I do want to call out is about having boundaries in all aspects of your life. One of the things I noticed when I was looking into this topic is that there's a ton of articles and resources about the benefits of setting boundaries in a variety of relationships. So family and children aside, the information on setting personal boundaries is abundant. It's so important to set boundaries in all of your relationships, but it obviously gets much more complicated when it comes to having children and establishing boundaries for yourself and them. And I did want to mention also my experience with my mom on all of this. I've noticed I try really hard to approach it as a conversation with her and not as a please don't do this with my kids type of conversation. But I've noticed that if I ask her to do something in a particular way with the kids or not to do something, or I try to bring it up casually and not in a scolding manner, or maybe not when it's happening, like after the fact, so that she doesn't think that I'm reprimanding her in front of the kids in that instance, but she always responds to me with hurt feelings and anger. And I might be speculating here, but it feels to me as though she thinks I'm attacking her parenting.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe in her mind, she thinks that I'm discrediting her decisions that she made when we were younger. And in reality, I'm just, a grown woman with my own thoughts and feelings about things. And I just have a different approach. And so I'm just trying to kindly say that, but it doesn't matter how I approach her or how I come across. I think she's taking it as an attack on her parenting. It actually has absolutely nothing to do with her. Any caregiver who's, involved with my kids, I would say the same thing. So I don't know if you have any experience with that.
Yeah, and I think it's hard too because growing up, I never wanted to be in a confrontational situation. Even like we talked earlier about the enmeshment, I was always very aware of, the emotions of my family. So sometimes it was hard as an adult to set boundaries without hurting someone's feelings. two things came to mind for me. Number one, I don't want my feelings being hurt because I'm trying to walk on eggshells. But most importantly, I need to teach my daughter how to set boundaries for herself one day as well. And we're the first role models our kids have. So them seeing us set boundaries confidently is really going to teach our children how to handle conflict in the future. And you made a great point. It's not about your mom. It's not about anyone. It's about what you want and what you want for your kid. So I think I've handled it in a way where I just explain this is something that I'm comfortable with, or this is something that I feel. And, I'm sorry if it makes you guys upset, or I'm sorry if it comes across this way, but in my heart, this just doesn't sit right with me. I've gotten pretty far with my family when I speak in this way. As I've mentioned too, that, we've come a long way with discussing boundaries and what we're comfortable with. However, on my husband's side, it is a little bit more difficult because, they take the path of us not thinking they're qualified grandparents. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter who it is. I can't fold for them. I can't fold for my parents. I can't fold for my best friend. What I feel is right for my kid is going to always come first, because if God forbid something happens, it's going to be my conscience. So I just think articulating things the best way you can and not letting people's reactions become a personal conflict for you. And that's hard. That's a really hard thing to handle.
Yeah, you're so right. Thinking about, I don't want to be hurt, or I don't want to have to worry or have anxiety over something. So I'm going to voice this boundary to whoever, and their reaction is not what I would want, or their reaction comes with pain or anger, or I don't know, they feel attacked maybe by what I'm asking. It's so important for me to feel at peace that I can't let that deter me from making these decisions for my kids. And I can't back down and just say, okay, never mind. You do it however you want to do it because I don't want to upset you. And I think I've come a long way with that as well, especially with my mom, where I felt maybe a little bit less inclined to bring something up because I knew that it would start a chain reaction of angst and unpleasant feelings for a few weeks after the fact until we bounced back. And then the next thing would come up and it would start that cycle all over again. But I don't back down. You have to be that role model for your kids. You have to give yourself that peace of mind and make sure that you're doing the best that you can for them, regardless of what the other reaction is.
Yeah. And I think the one thing you mentioned when you said we can't just be like, all right, do it the way you want, because I've read somewhere that we're raising our kids at a different time and to prepare them for a different world, whereas our parents raised us for a world that no longer exists. So as much as they may offer great advice, when it comes to specific things like taking them in a car or, bringing them to certain places or having them eat certain foods when now everything is filled with chemicals and toxins, and I feel like there's so much more to worry about now than the world we lived in prior. So I feel like we could take bits and pieces of advice and apply what we think is right or what we did enjoy from our childhood. But at the end of the day, we can't just let them have full autonomy and control over our kids. I agree with you. I don't like the conflict. I don't like dealing with anyone with hurt feelings. But I just think what I want to do for my child trumps anyone's feelings. It is a priority to me, and they can either be on the bandwagon or make things difficult. And of course, making things difficult just throws a wedge in the relationship. And then it's just not comfortable for anybody, including the child.
100% agree. It's not always easy to set boundaries. And as we've talked about, it's not always receptive on the other side. And feelings can get hurt and it can be challenging, but that shouldn't stop you from establishing the boundaries. And research has shown that there are numerous benefits of establishing boundaries within families. The number one reason that I've seen in most of my research is improved communication. So clearly defined boundaries facilitate open and honest communication among family members. And when individuals feel comfortable expressing their needs and concerns, conflicts are less likely to arise and misunderstandings can be effectively resolved. And typically there's a lot less misunderstandings because the boundaries have been clearly stated. I've seen this with my in-laws, where the more I speak up and the more I voice my concerns and how receptive and ready they are to accommodate them makes me feel really comfortable that I can continue to voice any sort of boundary, whether it's minor or bigger, and they're going to go ahead and support me. So I think it has improved our communication.
I see this too with my family. It's almost like that building of trust just opens so much more opportunities. From when my daughter was born to now, my parents and even my siblings who are 21 and 14 are still very much receptive to my boundaries. I can list into detail, if I'm leaving my daughter there, what I expect, what I want, what she can have to eat, not eat, bedtime. And I know later when I come to pick her up, they're going to have followed through everything that I requested. And it's just very refreshing because it's building that trust so much that when I'm not there with her, those worries don't trickle into my mind of what's going on behind my back. Because I know in my heart, if anything were to happen, my mom and dad would have the best interest of my child and follow through with my expectations. So I think setting good boundaries is so important and beneficial because not only does it really build that relationship between you and the parent, but then also the grandparent and the child, because there's so much trust and love and respect. It really allows the child to thrive in a family that communicates and cares about one another.
The second benefit that I have on my list here is enhanced emotional well-being. Healthy boundaries promote emotional well-being by reducing stress and anxiety. When individuals feel empowered to set limits, they experience greater emotional resilience and a sense of control over their lives. As hard as it can be to set boundaries sometimes, especially with someone who may not be very receptive, getting it off of my chest and really voicing that concern, and then however that person is going to take it, whether they're going to be supportive or not, I'm reducing my stress and anxiety. I've voiced my concern. I've made sure that it's clear what I expect when it comes to my children, and that gives me great peace of mind. What are your thoughts on that one?
I want to talk about that part where you mentioned the anxiety, if you basically don't speak up and use your voice. I think this was something that was very apparent when we dealt with my husband's side is anytime they would disregard our feelings or concerns, it almost sets us back 20 steps. Not only does it make it harder to communicate moving forward what our boundaries are, but then now there's that anxiety around, are they going to judge me? Are they going to feel what we're saying is appropriate? Even though, again, we talked, it doesn't matter. I think it's very important for grandparents to kind of understand that, they're not the parents in this situation. And I think if we were allowed with my husband's side to voice our opinions and not feel judged and to feel enhanced emotionally in that way, I think it would have fostered a whole better relationship with them and my daughter where they would be involved as much because ultimately it comes from that sense of reassurance and that emotion that we're talking about and feeling heard. And because we're not heard, it really does bring on a lot of anxiety and worried of being judged. And we shouldn't have to feel that way.
Do you feel that you're getting anxiety from voicing your boundary?
I think it's coming from voicing it and not voicing it at the same time. So I think anytime we do voice it, it's almost like we're ready for the backlash. And it may not be at that moment, but we know later on that night we'll get a phone call questioning our concerns. But then I also feel, there's times where we try to be the bigger person and wait it out, give it a second chance. But then that just gives us even more anxiety because now we have to walk on eggshells when we shouldn't have to do that. It also makes me feel very guilty when I have to walk on eggshells to appease someone else's feelings. It makes me feel like I'm not sticking up for my kid. And that's very concerning to me. So it's a twofold. There's anxiety when you do speak up and then anxiety when you don't speak up.
So that's really at the point of end all be all boundary. If the backlash keeps coming and the disrespect keeps coming, at what point do you just put your foot down and take a step back from the relationship? I think that is an important part. I just want to cover the last 3 benefits that I have here of establishing boundaries with your family. The next one is respect for individual autonomy. So boundaries uphold the importance of individual autonomy within the family. And by respecting each other's boundaries, family members acknowledge and honor each other's unique identities, preferences, and personal space. This fosters a sense of mutual respect and understanding within the family unit, contributing to overall harmony and cohesion. A lot of what I've experienced with this is as I've grown up and kind of come into my own and really have felt differently about things and done my own research and figured out how to approach life, that uniqueness I don't feel is always respected. And I'm still kind of looked at as this child, whereas now I'm a grown up. I've established what I want, what I feel, how I view the world, and that autonomy is not always translating. So another reason to be setting boundaries is to make sure that my family members understand that I've grown as a person, and I would hope that they could see that and respect my beliefs and how I'm approaching parenting in the world. So next is healthy interdependence. We talked a little bit about family enmeshment. And while boundaries promote individual autonomy, and that's important, they also encourage healthy interdependence among family members, which is different from enmeshment, right? So when boundaries are clearly defined and respected, individuals feel secure in relying on each other for support and assistance without fear of overstepping personal boundaries. So when you're in a jam or you need help with something, you have no problem reaching out, and you know that your personal boundaries are going to be respected, or your boundaries for you and your child are going to be respected in those situations where you're at your most vulnerable or in need of the most help. And the last benefit of establishing boundaries is the prevention of enmeshment. So we did talk about this. Boundaries serve as a productive barrier against enmeshment, and research has shown that enmeshed families often experience higher levels of conflict, stress, and interpersonal difficulties. But I think that you've done a great job of explaining how there are different levels of enmeshment, and it sounds like your family has gone from maybe enmeshment and now you're closer to healthy interdependence. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I definitely think so. And I think it all clicked for me too, when I became an adult. And like you were talking about before, my parents also coming to that realization that I'm not a little kid anymore, that I am now a mom. They need to look at me and give me that autonomy and also encourage me to do what I think is right. And with being in an enmeshed family, I was struggling to understand where my parents were coming from, why they were so involved with, my life decisions. But then now to be a mom myself, it's really important for a family to grow that way, because not only does it help to break generational curses, but it helps better relationships with you and your children, and you're not bringing in past traumas. But then you also get to bring in the joy of what made your childhood so special. And I'm grateful that I can have that with my family and now my daughter and soon to be 2 daughters. Healthy interdependence is always what we're striving for.
So we're going to move on to our last point here, and we're going to talk about how you establish healthy boundaries. I do want to reiterate that it is never too late to speak up or set boundaries for you and or your children, even if something has happened 5 or 6 times in a manner that you didn't want or feel comfortable with. It doesn't mean that on the 7th time you can't speak up and say, I don't like the way this is happening, or I would like it to happen a different way. You shouldn't carry that uncomfortableness with you, even though it's happened that way before. So that's also something that I've struggled with, where I just kind of let things continue to go because I have let them go, and it's not going to hurt anybody for me to say, you know what, I'm actually not okay with this. I'd rather have it be this way, or I'd rather have my kid not exposed to X.
I think there's no right or wrong way to set healthy boundaries. I do think, though, there is a way to do it that you're most comfortable with. So I think being just very clear and direct and straightforward. And I think not anticipating a reaction, going into it, not fearful of what the person's going to think, what they're going to say, how they're going to feel, because again, ultimately it's your boundary. And I think if there is, unfortunately, backlash, just, remaining calm and polite and explaining what this means to you personally and avoiding casting judgment, it's not going to get anywhere to argue over it. So I think explaining what it means to you for them to respect this boundary and why it's important to you. And then also the benefit of the child. What is it that you're aiming to benefit for your child with this boundary? And I think regardless, just standing your ground and not being afraid to repeat yourself.
That is such a great way to explain that. That is really great advice. Thinking about my experiences, something that's worked for me before establishing any boundaries or voicing any boundaries is really figuring out what my boundaries are. I've taken the time to reflect on my needs and my values and what I want for my kids, exactly like you're saying. And I have to consider what I'm comfortable with and what I'm not comfortable with. Are there any deal breakers where I really need to put my foot down? Are there things that aren't the end of the world and that I could let slide? And so for me, anything around health, safety, and respect are my absolute deal breakers.
And I would resonate, with those deal breakers. I definitely think we have a very similar mindset with that. I think safety obviously is up there. I think with having daughters, not wanting my daughters alone in a room with any male in the family, I just don't agree with it. And that's number one to me. Also the car. If I'm not driving, something in me doesn't sit right. God forbid something happens, she's not in the car with me. Now I don't want to hold it against someone else for having my daughter in the car. So, and then respect. Kids need to understand that that there's no lying, there's no secrets. So if anybody is interfering with that, that's a huge problem and actually a huge red flag. I just think overall positivity. Maybe it's wrong of me to want to shelter my kids, but in mommy and daddy's house, everything's happy. They're heard. They will be respected. That's just what I can only hope and wish for my kids.
Yeah, 100% agree. Okay, so wrapping up, there's some things that I uncovered that I really want to share with you listeners. Once you figure out where you stand and what's important to you, the next step is communicating your needs and boundaries to whomever it applies to. Can't control how it's going to be received, but you can be confident in your convictions and voice your concerns. Communicate your limits by expressing your boundaries openly and assertively. Be clear and specific about what you need and why it's important. And Bryanna, I think you explained that really beautifully. Research I found by communication scholars like Deborah Tannen emphasize the importance of assertive communication and setting boundaries without resorting to conflict or hostility. So be assertive, be clear, but be respectful. Some other things to consider once you've communicated your boundaries: be consistent when you're enforcing them. So consistently enforcing your boundaries reinforces that they're important and they help establish a new dynamic within your family. Allowing others to cross your boundaries could make them feel like they don't need to take them seriously in the future. Secondly, know your limits and be willing to say no when necessary. Remember, it's okay to prioritize your own well-being and obviously your children's well-being as well. Hold others accountable when they overstep those limits. And don't be afraid to seek support from family members or a therapist who can help provide guidance and encouragement. All right, so moving on to our final thought. It's all okay. Whatever you're feeling is right for you and your family. You don't have to explain that to anybody. Gut feelings are a real thing. Your mother's intuition is a real thing. You have to trust yourself, and no one else has to understand where you're coming from. You can do your best to clearly explain it, but at the end of the day, it's up to you what you want to do with your children and what boundaries you want to set for your family. You may look at boundaries that you've set and think, was I overprotective? Or maybe that was a little bit extreme, but who cares? I would rather be overprotective than have something happen and beat myself up for the rest of my life because I didn't speak up when I was uncomfortable with something. Is there anything you'd like to add, Bryanna?
I definitely love all of that. And I agree. And I think ultimately knowing when enough is huge too. If with setting boundaries causes conflict with someone, whoever it may be, and it's a repeated issue, it's okay to take a step back and just knowing, yeah, mother intuition is guiding you to make these decisions for a reason. If you're the bad guy because you want what's best for your child, then you know what? I'll be the bad guy all day because I'm always going to choose what's best for my children.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Bryanna, for being with me today. I appreciate your time and all of your awesome insight into this topic. Be sure to follow or subscribe so that you never miss an episode and share with your millennial mom friends. Thanks, everybody, for listening.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to Momming as a Millennial. If you enjoyed the episode, please share it with a friend or on social. You can find more from me at contemplativemama.com. Until next time.